Suppose you meet a group of humans who engages in practices they consider unconventional. They often eat other people slowly alive in painful processes. They sometimes eat their own young when they get hungry, and they implant microchips into other people as tracking devices that eventually lead those people into drowning. In this presentation, I'd like to explain why I think species membership itself matters morally. I'll do this not by analyzing certain traits of species membership, but by saying that our core intuitions morally happen to suggest that species membership does matter. So why is this discussion important? So oftentimes in animal ethics, the debate comes up of what makes it so that human interests are put above animal interest. Some might say stuff like mental capacity might put human interest above animals. Others might say species membership itself, and there are a couple other options as well. Oftentimes, the mental capacity argument seems to fail as we find that humans who have a substantially lower mental capacity are still as morally important as humans who don't. And so furthermore, we might suggest that species membership itself is morally significant. And this is where I'm going to go with this discussion, suggesting that species membership is itself important. So like the example I was giving earlier, first I want to go over some of the harms that free-living or wild animals cause to each other. So we have certain kind of beetles that paralyze and eat amphibians in slow and painful processes. We have parasites that affect their host and eventually lead them to drown themselves. And additionally, chimpanzees occasionally engage in infant killing and cannibalism. And this is just a very brief summary of some of the things that might happen between animals. Typical predation is also very common. So despite the harms that free-living animals cause to each other, some animal rights theorists have a hands-off approach to intervention. And this is pretty morally intuitive. We might think, why should humans intervene in nature or in the lives of animals? And Claire Palmer has referred to this as the laissez-faire intuition and notes that it runs deep in animal rights theory. It's pretty common even among those who support animal rights and like to say that humans and animals are on equal footing morally. It's still pretty common to support these laissez-faire intuitions. Okay, so this is a basic syllogism for the argument I'm running. A syllogism is simply a laying out of the different premises of an argument and explaining why they might lead to a conclusion. So the first premise I want to defend is that if species membership is not morally significant, we're obligated to prevent predation of free-living animals by other free-living animals. So this premise is basically just saying that if species membership is not morally significant whatsoever, then we're really obligated to prevent the harms I was discussing earlier in the presentation. But premise two is that we're not really obligated to prevent these harms, and we can find this intuitively through laissez-faire intuitions, as discussed earlier. It seems very common among animal rights theorists even to think that we're not really obligated to help these animals out. And so the conclusion here is that species membership is morally significant. And we'll see that this is a valid argument, meaning that it works logically, as in if the premises are true, the conclusion follows. And we can see that this is in the form of not P implies Q, not Q, and therefore P. Okay, so one objection people might have to the argument I laid out is that it's circular. Some might say that we're not accepting that second premise unless we accept the conclusion. And here I want to argue with this sort of reasoning by saying that what it means for an argument to be circular is that the justification of one of the premises relies on the conclusion, and that is not the case here. It seems like many animal rights theorists who like to think that species membership is not morally significant still have these laissez-faire intuitions supporting our second premise. And for those reasons, it seems like the conclusion simply follows from the two premises and is not supporting as justification for the second premise. All right, so there are four other approaches people might have to sort of get out of this argument. So the first one is the fallibility model, suggesting that the reason we have these laissez-faire intuitions is because we know the limits of human fallibility and that if we interfered in nature, it would cause great harm that we might not be able to predict. Second is a consequentialist view, which suggests that interfering with animals in this way would, in the long run, cause more harm than good, and that's why we have these laissez-faire intuitions. The third view is contextual or sovereignty views, and I'm going to be mostly taking sovereignty views from the book Zoopolis, and this is more or less suggesting that these free-living animals or wild animals live on their own and support themselves in communities, and that we should not interfere. And lastly, I want to look at flourishing accounts, which states that in order to interfere with these free-living animals, we are interrupting their flourishing, harming their well-being and reproduction in the long run, and so we shouldn't interfere. Okay, so first let's look at some consequentialist views. Let's say you're in the wild and you come across a deer that's stuck either under a net or under a log. Now you might think that, oh, like it's okay to help this deer. It seems like it's going to be in great harm and probably die under this log or under this net. However, in the consequentialist view, people might say that, yeah, but if we let a lot of deers free by doing this, then it could harm deers in the future by making them worse genetically and eventually lead to more harm than good. Furthermore, you might suggest that if you let every deer under a log free, it would lead to overpopulation of deers and eventually lead to their harm and the harm of other species. Now, I want to say that the consequentialist view here does have some value, but we wouldn't respond in the same way to human beings. Let's say that human beings were getting stuck under nets or logs in nature, we would immediately go to rescue them. We wouldn't be calculating these consequentialist sort of calculations and trying to figure out what's the best expected utility. No, we would save the humans. And I think the reason we have a difference between humans and deer here is because species membership itself has some moral significance. Next, I'd like to tackle the contextual and sovereignty views, sort of suggesting that animals have their own sovereign rule and kingdom. I think this is one of the strongest views that I'm going to consider here, but I also think it fails to account for species membership. And I think the reason that it does this is because even though we might consider animals to be able to sovereignly govern themselves, the harms done by animals to other animals are so severe, and the harms done to animals simply by nature, like the cold or diseases, is also very severe to the point where if it was done to humans, we might want to intervene. For example, we might suggest that if humans were substantially starving or freezing to death, or if humans were continuously eating each other, or causing long and painful processes of deaths to each other, we would want to intervene, even if they were part of another country that sovereignly rules itself. And for those reasons, it seems like our intuitions about what to do for humans and animals are different, and this is because species membership is intuitively morally significant. And this view is put forward by Donaldson and Kymlicka in Zoopolis, the sovereignty views. The next view I want to talk about is a fallibility model, which suggests that if humans intervene in the lives of free-living animals, it could have unintended consequences that us humans might not know. And right, this is certainly true. Like we can think of situations where humans have tried to intervene ecologically and it's caused lots of harms that were unintended. However, again, if we relate this case to human beings who are caused such severe harm, we might think that we would want to help them and do further research to clarify these cases, right? So like if human beings were like freezing very consistently in the nature, or if human beings were suffering such severe diseases or eating each other, we might think that while we want to find cures to these diseases and help these human beings, and then do research into the ways that these cures might have unintended consequences and then prevent those. Lastly, the flourishing account argument. This suggests that it is okay to leave animals alone or allow them to harm each other so long as it's beneficial for their overall flourishing as a species. And I think in this case, we run into problems with the logic of the Larder style counterexamples. So I might do a video on this in the future, but it's basically the idea that Well, maybe it's okay to cause harms to animals in some degree, so long as we are also allowing these animals to reproduce and flourish, right? Many of these animals wouldn't exist if it weren't for us farming them, and even if we are causing them great harms when we do farm them, maybe it's like perfectly okay to allow them to flourish as a species and just harm them as individuals. However, I don't think this is really what we want to be saying about these animals if species membership is not morally significant. And the reason for that is, yeah, we wouldn't say the same thing about humans as a species, right? We'd want to help individual humans flourish and not just humanity as a species. And so I think in this situation, again, we're relying on laissez-faire intuitions and this intuition that species membership has some moral significance. Lastly, I want to cover that animal welfare still does matter. So even if species membership is morally important, well-being of animals still holds moral weight. And furthermore, we might suggest that yes, human interests might matter more than the interests of animals, but animal interests are still morally important. In fact, someone might reject my argument altogether by just rejecting these laissez-faire intuitions, saying that species membership is not morally important, and because of that, we should really be helping these free-living animals, potentially relocating a lot of them into zoos or doing other ways to prevent harms done to them. And also, I'd like to say that harms done to animals are often widespread and worth addressing, and many of these harms are caused by and done by humans. And so we should still want to address this, even if their interests aren't as morally significant as the interest of humans.